Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
It always starts with that tone of voice Ray uses, the one where he leans on the word bro like it's a favor you owe him just for being blood, and every syllable carries that same grin he's had since we were kids, wide, careless, and cocky enough to make you want to knock it off his face. I should have said no the second he stepped onto my porch wearing that fake innocent look he always puts on when he wants something for free, but instead, I stood there like a fool with my hand halfway to my pocket, keys already jangling without permission. He didn't even pretend to be subtle about it. "Come on, Mike, just for an hour," he said, dragging out the word hour like it was smaller than it really was. "I gotta run over to Carla's, her car's in the shop, and she needs help moving a couch or something." "You'd be helping her too. Not just me. Real gentleman move." I looked at the truck, my truck, the one I'd been fixing up piece by piece for the better part of 8 years. It wasn't fancy or fast, but it was mine in every meaningful way, paid for in full, worked on with my own hands, and taken care of like it was the last thing in my life that hadn't let me down. A '93 Chevy C1500, emerald green, the paint polished to the point where even the rust pretended not to exist. It wasn't new, but it was solid, and it ran smoother than most things made in the last 2 decades. "You got gas money?" I asked, already knowing the answer, already hating myself for asking it like that was going to be the line I held. Ray just snorted. Did that thing where he slaps his thigh and grins like we're both in on the joke. "Course I do, Mike. This ain't the OL days. I'm working now, remember? I'm good for it. I'll be back before dinner, cross my heart." He didn't have gas money. He didn't have a job either, not a real one. Ray was always working on something, which usually meant moving furniture for cash under the table, maybe doing deliveries for a buddy until someone fired him or his ex found out he was still sleeping on couches he swore he'd moved off of. But I handed him the keys anyway, because somewhere under all the common sense I'd built up over the years, there was still that dumb part of me that wanted to believe he'd come through just once. He drove off with one arm out the window and the radio already too loud, and I stood there on the porch like a man watching his own wallet sail off in a kite. The sun was just starting to go down behind the trees, and I figured maybe, just maybe, he'd surprise me. Maybe this time the hour would actually be an hour. It wasn't. Dinner came and went. 8 o'clock passed. Then 9. I tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. Around 10, I stopped pacing and just sat on the porch in a metal chair that squeaked every time I shifted. By midnight, I'd stopped hoping. I didn't call again. I just stared at the dark road like it owed me something. At 2:06 in the morning, headlights finally swept across the yard. Not the calm, even glow of a vehicle pulling in respectfully, but the erratic strobe of a drunk cowboy riding steel. The truck was dragging something under it, something that clanged every 10 feet, and the front grille was hanging like a busted jaw. Ray stumbled out of the cab laughing, smelling like gas station whiskey and Marlboro regrets. "Phew," he said, staggering toward the porch. "Man, that couch was heavier than it looked." I didn't speak. I walked to the edge of the porch and looked at what was left of my truck. The passenger side door was caved in, one of the mirrors was missing entirely, and the windshield had a spider web crack that reached from the middle all the way to the top right corner. "You hit something," I said, keeping my voice flat. Ray waved his hand like that was beside the point. "Pfft, mailbox. Maybe a pole. Nothing big. I mean, it's a truck, right? Ain't that what it's for?" The words didn't register at first. My heart was already racing in that slow, sinking way it does when you realize there's no rewind button, no undo, just the ugly weight of what's done sitting there like a dead thing in your chest. "You were drinking," I said. "Just a little," he replied, slurring slightly. "Carla and I had some shots. Celebrating the new couch." I didn't ask about Carla. I didn't ask about the couch. I just looked at the only thing I'd spent the last 10 years building with my own damn hands, now twisted and scratched and bleeding oil onto my gravel like it was trying to apologize. "You're gonna pay for this," I said, almost to myself. That's when he did it. That smirk. That smug, nose-wrinkling smirk that had gotten him out of speeding tickets and bad grades and breakups for as long as I could remember. He shrugged, turned away like it was all too boring to even pretend to be sorry about, and said, "Good luck makin' me pay for it." Then he walked inside my house like it was his, like the night hadn't shattered anything at all, and left me standing there with nothing but the sound of leaking fluids and the slow burn of something old waking up in my chest. I didn't shout. I didn't chase after him. I just stared at the wreck, nodded once, and went back inside. Because if there's one thing I've learned after a lifetime of cleaning up Ray's messes, it's this: sometimes the best way to break something back is to let it believe it got away clean. But this time, I wasn't picking up the pieces. This time, I was building something else. I sat in the kitchen the next morning, sipping bitter coffee that had been sitting too long on the burner, watching the sunlight crawl up the curtains like it didn't know it was lighting up the aftermath of a slow burn disaster. The smell of motor oil still hung in the air from where Ray parked what was left of my truck in the driveway like a mangled monument to disrespect, and every now and then, I'd glance out the window just to make sure it was still there. Not because I thought someone might steal it, but because some part of me still couldn't believe he'd actually done it and just walked inside like it was no big deal. Ray wasn't even home. He'd left sometime before dawn, probably with Carla or maybe crashing at someone else's place, leaving behind the scent of stale whiskey and arrogance. I didn't care where he'd gone. I was just grateful the house was quiet again, for the first time in a while. But that morning wasn't about the truck, not really. It hadn't been just about the truck even when I saw it limping up the driveway like a wounded animal. It was about the way Ray looked me in the eye after wrecking something I loved and told me, with that half-laugh he's used his whole life, that I'd never get a dime out of him. Like I was stupid for even thinking I should try. Like the concept of accountability was some joke only chumps fell for. And the truth is, I'd been falling for it for years. It started small, like it always does. Ray was 4 years younger than me, and somehow, that always gave him a pass. Our mom used to call him my little spark plug, which basically meant he could set things on fire, and she'd still smile and call him energetic. I'd be the one putting the fires out, mopping up the mess, calming down the neighbors, fixing what got broken. "He's just got a wild heart," she'd say, like that was some kind of medical condition only patients could treat. She said it when he threw a brick through the garage window playing home run derby. She said it when he got suspended for selling fake concert tickets in 10th grade. She even said it when he skipped out on our dad's funeral because he wasn't in the right headspace. Meanwhile, I was the one who showed up. Always. When Mom passed, I handled the funeral arrangements, signed the paperwork, boxed up her house, paid off what little she owed on the property. And when it came time to read the will, I didn't expect anything grand. She didn't have much to give. But even then, even at the end, she found one last way to tip the scales. She left Ray the bigger share not because he earned it, but because he needs it more. That was the exact phrase she wrote in her own shaky handwriting on the back of the envelope. "Michael, you've always been responsible. Ray needs more help right now. I hope you understand." I did understand. I understood perfectly. She'd spent her whole life throwing cushions under Ray every time he jumped off something dangerous, and now she'd done it one last time from the grave. And me? I'd been the cushion. Again. So no, this wasn't about a truck. This was about a pattern, a life full of moments where I bit my tongue while Ray lit the match. A life where I drove him to job interviews he never prepared for, bailed him out of the station when he got too drunk to remember whose mailbox he flattened, and even lent him money after Mom's funeral when he said he was trying to get back on his feet. He never got back on his feet. He just learned I'd carry him when he refused to stand. But something changed when I saw the truck. Maybe it was because that thing represented all the hours I'd put into something just for myself, something no one could take credit for. Maybe it was because I finally understood that letting Ray treat me like a fallback wasn't helping him. It was keeping both of us stuck in a story that should have ended a long time ago. So I made some calls. I didn't shout. I didn't storm into his room with threats or fists. I didn't even tell him I was doing it. I just got quiet, the kind of quiet that means something's coming, and the other person doesn't even realize it. And after a long pause, I went to the hallway closet, pulled out an old storage box full of documents, and opened a manila folder I hadn't looked at in years. Across the front, in my own handwriting, were the words, Plan B. Ray, it wasn't a joke. It wasn't something I wrote in anger. It was something I put together years ago, after the second time he borrowed money and ghosted me for months. Just in case. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I finally accepted that hoping he'd change wasn't a plan, it was a slow bleed. The folder had everything: receipts, contracts, emails, even a few tax documents I'd quietly pulled together when I helped him file once, and he left me access to some of his old forms. It also had one very specific legal note from our father's lawyer, a man Ray had completely forgotten about because he never thought those old land deeds mattered. But they did. Ray never wanted his half of the family land. Said it was just a patch of weeds and taxes. I'd been paying on it for years. Quietly. Consistently. I never told him. Never needed to. Until now. Because if there's one thing Ray understood more than trucks or family or guilt, it was paperwork with his name on it and numbers he couldn't afford. And I was about to remind him that even lazy history leaves a paper trail. So I picked up the phone and called someone who'd been waiting a long time for me to finally get tired of playing second fiddle. I didn't even need to explain. I just said 5 words. It's time. Open the file. Then I hung up, leaned back, and exhaled. Because this wasn't about the truck anymore. This was about ending a cycle with pen, paper, and precision. Not fists. Not shouting. But something sharper. Something Ray never saw coming. Small towns have long memories, but even longer silences, the kind that build up over years of people pretending not to see the truth about someone they've known since grade school. Ray had always been the kind of guy who could walk into a bar with yesterday's sweat still clinging to his collar and still get 3 slaps on the back, a free beer, and someone telling him he should have gone pro. Even though he barely finished community college and once sold a flat screen he'd stolen from his own roommate. It didn't matter. He had that crooked smile and an endless supply of stories that were just funny enough to keep people from asking questions, and he knew how to be just useful enough in just the right moment to stay on the inside of every circle that should have long since pushed him out. After wrecking my truck and laughing in my face about it, Ray somehow found the nerve to strut around town like he'd just won a prize instead of shattering something that wasn't his to begin with. I heard from 3 different people within a week. The guy at the gas station, a neighbor who ran into him outside the liquor store, and the woman at the post office who always remembers my name, that Ray had been bragging about how he borrowed the old man's truck, and things got a little wild, like it was a country song instead of a blatant act of recklessness. He made it sound like I'd given him a ride and a 6-pack and told him to go have fun. What made it worse wasn't the way people laughed along with him, it was how familiar it all felt. How easily folks around here let Ray rewrite the story in real time just because they'd heard his voice more than mine over the years. And just like that, the truth got bent out of shape in the same funhouse mirror he'd always lived in, one that made him look charming, and made me look like the uptight older brother who didn't know how to take a joke. About a week later, he rolled through town in a different vehicle entirely. A silver convertible with a spoiler that looked like it belonged to someone still paying off prom tuxedos. It was loud, obnoxious, and clearly more expensive than anything Ray could reasonably afford, which only meant one thing: someone else was footing the bill. I didn't have to guess long. Her name was Tiffany, and she was new to town, young enough to still call it cute when Ray said something wildly inappropriate in public, and naive enough to believe his version of things when he told her he was on the cusp of a big turnaround. I watched them once from across the diner, him leaning back like a retired movie star while she laughed too loud at everything he said, looking at him like he might actually be the hero he was pretending to be. I didn't hate her for it. We all fall for masks before we learn to see the faces beneath. But I hated the way he looked at her like she was another seatbelt he didn't plan to wear. I waited another week before I made my move, careful not to rush, careful not to let my own anger bleed into the lines of the plan I'd already set in motion. Then I texted him, short and casual. "Hey, wanna grab lunch?" My treat. He replied in under 5 seconds. "Hell yes. Meet me at the Pit?" The Pit was an old barbecue joint that hadn't updated its menu since 1982, which meant it was Ray's favorite place to eat, drink, and pretend everything in life was still reversible. I got there early, grabbed a booth near the back, and ordered a sweet tea so I wouldn't be tempted to order something stronger. When he walked in, he looked like a man who thought he was winning, sunglasses tucked into his shirt collar, designer watch he probably didn't buy himself, and that same grin that had been keeping him out of real consequences since we were kids. He slapped me on the shoulder like nothing had ever happened. "Look at us," he said, sliding into the booth. "Two old dogs, still kickin'. Guess I didn't total your good mood along with that truck, huh?" I smiled, small and tight. "You're hard to stay mad at, Ray." "Exactly," he said, pointing at me like I'd just read a fortune cookie out loud. "You get it." The waitress came and went, taking our orders, and for a while, he rambled on about how things were really starting to turn, how he might have a buddy in Nashville who's looking to open a gym and might want him on board, how Tiffany's credit score was stupid high, and, honestly, she might be too good for me, but hey, I've got charm. I nodded, listened, even laughed at one point. Then I leaned in just a little and asked what I'd been saving. "So hey, been keeping up with your taxes?" He froze, just for a fraction of a second, and I knew that flicker meant more than 100 words could. But then he laughed again, pushed his plate away like the question was too absurd to entertain. "Taxes? What for?" he said. "I don't exactly play by the rules, Mikey." He said it like it was a point of pride, like dodging responsibility was a lifestyle choice instead of a warning sign. I just nodded again, kept my smile tight, and sipped my tea like I didn't already know what was coming next, like I hadn't already met with 2 lawyers and a retired accountant who'd helped our dad file his last returns, like I hadn't found the paper trail Ray left behind years ago when he was still dumb enough to use my name to co-sign a deal he forgot to pay back. The best part wasn't the trap itself. It was how natural it felt to let him walk right into it, laughing the whole way, thinking he was still the hero in a story where he hadn't even read the rules. And he wouldn't know what hit him until the envelope came with his name on it and numbers he couldn't lie his way out of. Because sometimes you don't have to yell. You just have to wait. And file. And smile. It had been years since I last stepped into the old brick office on Maple Street where my dad used to take us when things needed signing, when wills were being drawn up or the bank had a question he didn't quite trust to answer over the phone. The building hadn't changed much, same uneven floorboards creaking underfoot, same faded plaque on the door with gold letters spelling out Edward L. Sutter, attorney at law, and the same smell of paper, dust, and quiet authority lingering in the air like a ghost that refused to leave. Mr. Sutter had aged, of course, his hair now fully white, hands slower than I remembered, but his eyes were still sharp, still cutting through nonsense like a blade honed by decades of watching families eat themselves alive over what they thought they were owed. He smiled when he saw me, not the fake kind people give when they're checking boxes, but the kind you get from someone who remembers where you came from and knows exactly how many times you've shown up while everyone else disappeared. "Michael," he said, motioning for me to sit, "I thought you might come by someday." That line caught me off guard, and I raised an eyebrow. "That's so?" He nodded, shuffling a few papers aside like he already knew what I was about to ask. "Your father always figured you'd be the one cleaning up what your brother didn't bother finishing." That line landed harder than I wanted to admit, not because it was harsh, but because it was true, and there's something about hearing your quiet sacrifices spoken out loud by someone else that makes them feel more real, more permanent. I leaned forward, placed a thick envelope of documents on his desk, and said, "I want to talk about the land." Sutter nodded again, took the envelope without hesitation, and began flipping through the contents like a man flipping through a chapter he already read but needed to skim for the highlights. Inside were copies of tax receipts, payment confirmations, scanned utility statements, and one small note my father had written before he passed, acknowledging that I had taken over care and cost of the back 40 acres, not legally binding, but enough to prove intent. "You've been paying on it alone since 2014, he said after a few minutes, tapping a finger on the earliest receipt. "Ray never asked," I said, not needing to explain the rest. "He probably didn't know," Sutter replied without looking up. "He knew enough to ignore it," I answered. The truth was, that piece of land, 40 acres of mostly wooded brush, and an old hunting shack barely holding itself together, wasn't worth much on paper, but in this county, land was still land, and people who understood long-term value never dismissed it. My father had split it equally between us in the will, but Ray never lifted a finger to claim his half. Never paid the taxes, never signed the paperwork, never even visited it again after the funeral. I hadn't pushed, mostly because I didn't want to share it with someone who only saw value when it could be converted into a bar tab or an excuse. But I kept paying, quietly, regularly, out of principle, out of respect, maybe even out of stubbornness. Because I knew if I didn't, the land would be lost to time, and whatever little piece of my father's work remained would rot with it. Sutter finally leaned back, steepling his fingers as he looked at me with that same calculating calm he used when he explained death certificates to grieving widows and property line disputes to angry farmers. "You're the only one who's been keeping this land alive, Michael. And that means something." I nodded slowly. "Does it mean enough to shift the burden?" A small smile played across the corners of his mouth, the kind that doesn't come from joy, but from witnessing poetic symmetry. "If you wanted to, you could make it all his problem. And it'd be completely legal." That sentence hung in the air like a loaded question, and I sat with it for a long moment before responding. Because there was a difference between revenge and resolution, and I needed to know which one I was actually chasing. "Explain it to me," I said. And he did. Line by line, form by form, explaining how the taxes I'd paid, combined with Ray's inaction and his abandonment of the asset, created a trail of liability that could be redirected, not as punishment, but as delegation. All it would take was the right filing, the right letter, and the right moment. "It wouldn't look like payback," Sutter said. "It would look like responsibility." "And once it's transferred?" I asked. "Then the county will expect payment," he said. "Full back taxes, adjusted interest, plus penalties. Could be $30, maybe $35,000 total by now." I exhaled slowly. That number wasn't life-ruining, not for most, but for Ray, with no job, no savings, and a girlfriend already helping him lease a car he couldn't afford, it was an avalanche waiting for a single stone to roll downhill. "I don't want to bury him," I said after a pause. "I just want him to stop thinking there are no consequences." Sutter's smile faded. "Sometimes the only way to teach a man like Ray is to let the math do the talking." That night, I drove home with a folder full of leverage and a mind full of memories, not all of them kind. I thought about how many times I'd let things slide, how many small wounds I'd let scab over just to keep the peace. And I thought about that truck, broken and leaking and left like a carcass in my driveway, not because of an accident, but because of a pattern. Some people learn by being told. Some people need the ground to shake under them before they pay attention. Ray was the second kind. And it was time to shift the weight. Some people think revenge is about explosions, about big dramatic scenes and confrontations in parking lots with shouting, fists, and public apologies. Like in the movies where the villain always sees the light too late and the hero walks away with righteous music playing in the background. But the truth is, real revenge, clean, cold, irreversible revenge, moves quietly, like a blade sliding between ribs with no warning. And in my case, it didn't start with fire or fury. It started with paperwork. Dry, silent, deadly paperwork. I spent the next few weeks not yelling, not lecturing, not even speaking to Ray at all, which probably confused him more than anything else. He was used to backlash, used to tantrums and shouting matches he could twist around, used to people storming out so he could play the victim. But silence? That made him nervous. And I knew that, so I gave it to him in full. Meanwhile, I was working. Every night after dinner, after the house went quiet and my hands stopped shaking long enough to be useful, I'd sit at the table with a notepad, a stack of documents, and a laptop humming low as a diesel engine. I started with the basics: property records, tax ledgers, legal opinions, all of it connected to that patch of land Ray had long forgotten existed. According to the county, both our names were still attached, but I had done all the paying, all the upkeep, and that meant something legally. I hadn't realized how much until now. The land had appreciated over the years, not by much, but enough that unpaid taxes and assumed liability could turn into a small mountain if handled correctly. So I got to work. I filed a quitclaim deed for my portion, rerouted the billing structure, and submitted a change of interest form through the county clerk's office, naming Ray as the sole responsible party. Legally, it was clean. Logically, it was flawless. And ethically? Well, that depended on how many times you've been burned before you stopped feeling bad about putting out the fire on your own terms. I refinanced the remainder of my interest out of the shared assets, using the backdoor clauses left open in Dad's old will, the kind of thing you only notice if you actually read it line by line instead of just asking for your half. Ray had never read it. I knew that without asking. To make sure everything stuck, I tracked down an old friend of Dad's who still ran a timber management company. He'd once offered to buy the rights to log a portion of the wooded area, and while I had declined back then, I suddenly had a new offer, one that involved Ray's name on every single document and a request for payout routing that looked, on the surface, like a sweet deal. I bundled the timber agreement into a deferred payment plan, structured it under Ray's assumed ownership, and made sure all projected profits wouldn't even come close to covering the tax debt it would trigger. In short, I made Ray the proud beneficiary of a short-term cash payment with long-term consequences, and I did it all with forms he had left half-completed years ago when he thought he might flip the land someday. He had signed them. I had just waited for the right time to file. I worked slow. I worked careful. I checked and rechecked every signature, every timestamp, every number that could trip me up if someone looked too closely. But the best part was nobody would. Because on paper, this wasn't punishment. It was a routine asset transfer. It looked like a gift. In the middle of all this, I saw Ray twice, once at the diner, once walking out of the liquor store, both times grinning like a man who thought he'd already won. I waved back each time, polite, calm, uninterested. I didn't want him suspicious. I wanted him smug. Smug people don't read letters carefully. And so, after 3 weeks of slow, surgical movements behind the scenes, I stood at the post office with a thick white envelope in my hand, addressed in dark blue ink with clean, bold lettering that said his full name, Raymond T. Harper, and nothing else. Certified mail. Required signature. Inside was the trigger, a notification from the county, a property tax delinquency notice, a revised asset assignment, a pending bill from the IRS estimating $32,000 in owed back taxes, interest, and penalties. It was all tied to his name. Not mine. Not anymore. I sealed the envelope, handed it over the counter, and watched as the clerk stamped it, logged it, and slipped it into the outgoing bin with a weightless flick of her wrist. She had no idea what she was delivering. And he had no idea what was coming. But I did. Because sometimes, you don't need to raise your voice to settle a score. You just need the right signature, the right silence, and a knife sharp enough to cut clean without leaving a mess. And that knife was already in the mail. It was one of those crisp mornings where the cold settles into the bones of your porch, the kind of day when steam rises off your coffee and the air hangs still like it's waiting for something to break. I'd been up early, earlier than usual. Not out of nerves, but because something inside me knew the quiet wasn't going to last much longer. I'd been keeping a loose eye on the delivery schedule, checking the tracking number once or twice a day, not obsessively, but with the same methodical rhythm I'd used when fixing my truck before Ray turned it into a crime scene with wheels. The status had flipped to delivered late last night, which meant this morning would be the moment of impact. And sure enough, it didn't take long. I was sitting on the porch, coffee in one hand, dog curled up at my feet, when I heard the sound of tires skidding across gravel like someone trying to slow down only after they realized they were already too late. Ray's new sports car, the one his girlfriend had co-signed with a credit score he'd probably already started to damage, came barreling up the drive with all the subtlety of a bar fight. He didn't bother parking. He stopped halfway in the yard, door flung open before the engine fully shut off. He stormed toward me, wild-eyed, letter in one hand, and that telltale red hue crawling up his neck like a heat rash made of guilt and panic. He didn't say anything right away, just shoved the crumpled envelope in my face like it was a snake, and he expected me to flinch. "You think this is funny?" he shouted, voice cracking just enough to betray the fear under all that bluster. "You think this is a damn joke, Mike?" I didn't flinch. I didn't rise. I just took a slow sip of my coffee and looked at him the way a man looks at a storm he already boarded the windows for. "Told you I'd get my payment," I said calmly. Ray's face twisted, but not with confusion, he understood. Somewhere between the signature confirmation and the first few lines of that IRS notice, he had realized exactly what had happened, even if he didn't know how deep it went yet. He knew it wasn't just a letter. It was a reckoning. A paper trail with his name at the bottom and $32,000 of truth attached to every page. "You set me up," he growled, pacing now, waving the letter around like it might catch fire from how tightly he was gripping it. "This is fraud. This is illegal. You can't just dump this crap on me." "I didn't dump anything," I replied, setting the coffee down gently on the armrest. "You were always on the deed. I just made sure the county finally recognized who's responsible." He threw the envelope onto the porch like it might hurt me, but it landed with a pathetic flutter and slid under the swing like a leaf that didn't know where to fall. His fists clenched, but he didn't swing. He never did. Ray was a coward at heart, always loudest when the crowd was watching, always backing down when things got real. "You've ruined my life," he hissed, pacing again. "Do you even understand what you've done?" I stood then, slowly, not to intimidate him, but because I was done sitting through his tantrum. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "No, Ray. I gave your life back to you. You've just never had to carry it before." He stared at me, something flickering behind his eyes, maybe disbelief, maybe shame, maybe just the realization that this time, there wasn't going to be a bailout. No mom to cover the damage. No girlfriend clueless enough to cover the bill. No older brother ready to smooth the edges of another bad decision. He looked back at the car, back at me, and then down at the envelope like maybe it would change if he stared long enough. But numbers don't lie. Interest doesn't negotiate. And the IRS sure as hell doesn't take IOUs written in charm and excuses. "You don't understand," he said finally, quieter now. "I can't pay this. I don't have anything." "That makes two of us," I said. "Only difference is, I never asked you to." There it was. The truth, bare and bitter. I never wanted Ray to give me anything. I just wanted him to stop taking without consequence. And now, for the first time in his life, the math wasn't in his favor. He didn't stay much longer after that. He left the envelope on the porch, climbed back into his car, and peeled off with the kind of speed that usually meant something was being avoided. I didn't chase him. I didn't watch the road after he left. I just sat back down, picked up my coffee, and let the silence return like a loyal friend. Because some debts don't get paid with money. Some get paid with a moment, one sharp, unforgettable moment when the taker finally sees what they've done, and there's no one left to blame but the man in the mirror holding the bill. And Ray had just received his. In full. The thing about people like Ray is they don't go quiet after they've been caught, not at first, anyway. No, at first they scramble. They dig, they spin, they bargain. They throw every version of themselves at the wall, hoping one of them sticks long enough to change your mind. For the first few days after he got the letter, the calls came constantly. Morning, noon, midnight, like he thought if he caught me off guard, I'd suddenly forget how carefully I planned all this. He didn't start with anger. No, he went straight to the performance. Mike, he said in one of the early voicemails, his voice breathless like he'd just finished crying or just wanted to sound like it. I know I messed up, man. I know I've been an idiot. But 32 grand? Come on. You really think I deserve that? Another one came later the same night, a little harder, the guilt more aggressive. We're brothers. You don't do this to family. This is over a truck? Really? But I didn't answer. I didn't delete them either. I let them pile up, one after the other, a collection of his desperation dressed in all the different masks he could find in the drawer: wounded victim, angry man, misunderstood son, charming manipulator. I'd seen them all before, just never this concentrated, never this cornered. By the end of the week, he showed up again, this time not storming up the driveway, but creeping up the steps like a salesman who knew the product was defective. He was quieter now, less fire, more slime. His tone was almost soft as he stood on my porch, rubbing the back of his neck and rocking back on his heels like a kid caught shoplifting. Mike, he said, look, I get it. You were mad. You had a right to be. I wrecked your truck. I was a jerk. But this? This is too much. This is cruel. He looked at me like I was supposed to melt at the word cruel, as if his definition of suffering had ever involved actual consequence before now. I didn't say anything. I just waited, arms crossed, leaning against the doorframe like I had all day to watch him twist in the wind. I talked to someone, he went on, eyes scanning the yard instead of my face. Said maybe if you go down there and explain it was a misunderstanding, they could drop the penalties. Or reduce it. Maybe even cancel the lien. He looked up, smiling like he was pitching me a deal on a used lawnmower. I mean, you're good with words, he said. You always were the smart one. Just tell them I didn't know. We'll work something out. I let the silence stretch just long enough to remind him he wasn't the one in control of the tempo anymore. No, I said simply. His jaw tensed. He blinked twice, then gave me a look I'd seen 100 times, the one where his charm failed, and the real ray slipped through the cracks. You think you're better than me? He snapped, voice rising now. You think this makes you some kind of hero? You're a petty little coward hiding behind paperwork. I smiled, not because I found it funny, but because I knew right then that he still didn't understand. He still thought this was about a truck. You used Tiffany's credit to lease that car, I said quietly. Did she know you already owed $5 grand on a title loan when you walked into that dealership? That shut him up. The blood drained from his face like someone had pulled the plug. His mouth opened, then closed, but no words came out. He hadn't realized how much I still knew about him, how many people he'd hurt while I'd been busy swallowing the wreckage he left behind. She found out yesterday, I added, when they froze your joint account. I didn't call her. The IRS did. He looked like someone who had just realized the house was on fire and that he was the one holding the match. His voice dropped again, almost pleading this time. Mike, you've ruined my life. That was the sentence that finally lit the fuse in me, not anger, not rage, but a kind of raw, worn-out clarity I hadn't known I was capable of speaking out loud. No, Ray, I said, stepping forward so he had to look at me, really look at me. You wrecked mine. I just stopped cleaning it up. He stared at me like he didn't know whether to scream or cry, but I didn't wait to find out. I turned and walked back inside, leaving the door open just long enough to hear the final shuffle of his boots on the porch, the creak of the step, the click of the car door as he drove off slower than he ever had before. He didn't call again that week. But the silence he left behind said more than any apology ever could. The snow came early that year, heavy and slow, blanketing the yard in a quiet that felt earned, like the world had finally exhaled after holding its breath for too damn long. I sat on the front porch with a coffee mug wrapped in both hands, watching it fall steady onto the road, the mailbox, the roof of the new truck parked in the same spot where the old one used to rest before Ray carved a drunken scar through it like everything else he touched. The new truck wasn't fancy. I didn't go for anything flashy or loud, just a solid used F-150 in charcoal gray, dependable, clean, and paid for in full. I'd saved for it slowly, methodically, and when I drove it off the lot 2 weeks ago, no one handed it to me, no one co-signed, no one made a promise they wouldn't keep. It was mine. Entirely mine. Christmas morning came with that strange kind of stillness you only get in a place that's used to being overlooked, no traffic, no footsteps, just wind moving through trees and the crunch of ice forming along the gutters. I hadn't decorated, hadn't put up lights or a wreath, not because I was bitter, but because the older I got, the more I realized peace didn't need tinsel. I made myself a decent breakfast, fed the dog, played a little Merle Haggard on the old stereo, and let the world spin outside the walls of my house without asking anything from me. There'd been no calls from Ray. No texts. Not since that last conversation on the porch when he stood there holding his life like a broken radio, hoping I had one more fix in me. I didn't. And maybe he knew that finally, because this time, he didn't try again. He disappeared not with drama, not with slamming doors, just with silence, the kind that creeps in when someone finally runs out of bangles. A part of me wondered where he'd landed, if he was still in town or had taken off again like he always did when the walls started closing in. Maybe he'd gone south, following some vague promise of work or a woman willing to listen. Or maybe he was staying put, laying low, learning how to face the mirror without a backup plan. Either way, I didn't look for him. I didn't ask around. I figured if he wanted to be found, he'd find a way to be seen. But then, just after noon, I walked out to the mailbox like I always did, not expecting much, just a couple of flyers and maybe a bill or two. What I wasn't expecting was this single envelope sitting there, slightly bent, off-white, sealed shut with the kind of sloppy edge that comes from fingers that aren't used to writing anything by hand. My name was on it, not Mike, not Michael with a printed label, but handwritten, almost shaky, like whoever wrote it had hesitated a dozen times before finally pressing pen to paper. I didn't need to flip it over to know who it was from. The handwriting was wrong, the paper was cheap, but there was a kind of weight to it that made my stomach tighten. I held it for a long moment, standing at the edge of the driveway as the snow fell gently around me, quiet as breath. I didn't open it. Not right away. Maybe not ever. I just stared at it, turning it over in my hands like it might answer something before I had to ask. There was no return address, of course. Just that uneven scrawl, barely legible, pressed harder into the paper in some places like frustration had nearly ripped it. Could have been an apology. Could have been blame. Could have been a confession or a goodbye. I didn't know, and for once, I didn't feel the need to rush toward the answer. Because sometimes, knowing what someone has to say doesn't change what's already been done. Sometimes, the apology comes too late. And sometimes, it's not even about forgiveness. It's about the space between two people finally stretching long enough for peace to live in. I brought the envelope inside, set it on the kitchen counter, and poured myself another coffee. The dog looked at me like he knew something had shifted, tail thumping quietly against the floor without excitement, just presence. I watched the envelope from across the room like it might move on its own, but it just sat there, stubborn and quiet. And maybe that's the hardest part, not the wreckage or the noise, but the silence that follows once it's all over. Ray used to fill every space he walked into with chaos, laughter, lies, stories, excuses. Now, there was just this letter and the memory of his voice saying, "You ruined my life." But I hadn't. He had. Still, as the hours passed, I found myself walking by the envelope more than once, each time telling myself I didn't care what was inside. I told myself it didn't matter, that whatever Ray had written couldn't fix the years he spent tearing things down and expecting me to hold the frame steady. But the truth is, there was still a part of me, small and unwanted, that wanted to believe he might have finally understood. That maybe, just maybe, the silence meant he'd started listening to something other than his own excuses. But I didn't open it. Not yet. Maybe never. I just let it sit there under the soft hum of the fridge, beside a bowl of fruit I hadn't touched in 3 days, and thought about how some bridges don't explode or crumble with time, some just burn slowly, quietly, ember by ember. Until one day you look back and realize there's nothing left to walk across, and nothing worth trying to salvage on the other side. He used to smirk when he left destruction behind. This time, he left silence. I'm still deciding which one hurts less.